Hey guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. I am filming for you a very short series of videos on revising A-level history, specifically at this point, Tudor Rebellions. Now, my reasoning for this is that I genuinely believe, and I tell all the students I teach, that if you get a Tudor Rebellion question, it is like a gift from the exam board, because they are questions where you can show really strong, nuanced answers, and those conclusions I'm going to give you, so you have already got them, you've already pre-thought them. You can easily structure your argument really without much thought at all. Every single previous Tudor Rebellion question has been on cause. Sometimes they ask you questions about stability or about contentment of the masses of society, and obviously rebellions are going to play a role in those kind of essays, but where they are specifically referring to rebellion, it's always been about cause within the AQA exam board. So with that in mind, we actually have a very limited amount of factors that you would need to write about. And going and thinking about my structure, which I explain in my how to write A-level essays, really only need to worry about paragraph 1 being the factor in the question. For example, between this date and this date, finance was the main reason for rebellion, or religion, or whatever it might be. Then you have a different thematic factor, and then you finally have your nuanced paragraph where you might come out with a more sophisticated argument. For example, if the question was asking that most rebellions were caused by religion, you start with religion, you follow with economics, and you follow up by saying, actually, it was different for the upper classes and the populace. The upper classes were motivated by political factional strife, and they use religion as a cloak to incite the masses to join the rebellion. So I think these are great questions to get, and you should absolutely be answering the Tudor Rebellion question. Now, to help and support you, I'm going to film a couple of videos. This video is going to be all about the cause religion. I will follow that with a video all about the cause of economics and politics, and then I'll do a nuanced approach, and then finally I'll have an overview video that will just give you all of the conclusions really clearly with phrasing and paragraphs, etc., so you know exactly what to write. So make sure you subscribe so you are able to see all of these videos, as they will be very helpful to you in totality, in ensuring you can answer this question and get an A* on the paper. So let's start. We're looking at religion. Now, obviously that means that Henry VII is not going to be involved in this factor. There were no religious rebellions under Henry VII. He was a Catholic. Catholicism was the accepted religion in England. There were no issues of religion. It wasn't even, something which would come to mind as being a reason to be discontented in society. Henry VIII really starts off this process, obviously, of religious discontent in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, where he changed the faith in England from Catholicism to Protestantism. Now, this triggered the first religious rebellion, and probably the most significantly religious rebellion, the most threatening religious rebellion, the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. I have summarized my conclusion for this rebellion as saying that religion was a unifying factor or a cloak for latent socioeconomic issues, as well as political marginalization from the upper classes involved. A rebellion about religion after the Act of Supremacy was essentially a rebellion against the king. Now, I think there's no way of arguing that the Pilgrimage of Grace is anything but a primarily motivated religious rebellion. Religion spanned the social hierarchy as a cause from the elites, as a cause from the poorest members of the rebels. Everybody wanted to reverse the religious changes that Henry had introduced. However, what I'm suggesting here is that there were also quite significant socio-economic issues underlying the rebellion, and to say that it's solely a religious rebellion is too short-sighted. I also think we need to recognise the role that factionalism played. Many of the Catholic nobility had lost out at court. The Aragonese faction as well was or had lost notoriety after Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So those issues play a role. I'll go through them in my later videos on those other factors. But focusing on religion, here is the evidence that I would present about why Pilgrimage of Grace was a religious rebellion. So firstly, and I've tried to be extremely specific here to give you factors, to give you pieces of evidence that you won't just find in the textbook that everybody else is going to use, that are really specific with names or specific places, specific holy days that you can replicate and show A-star level knowledge. Ecclesiastical commissioners had alarmed many people. Parish clergy were being investigated by the Bishop of Lincoln, and a second had been authorized by the government to close down smaller monasteries. So this is really the idea that people were fearful of the rumors that were spreading about the closure of monasteries. And we've got the role of the Bishop of Lincoln as a specific character in that. Then we've got the fact that rebels from Louth and Horncastle drew up articles requesting that their abbeys were preserved. In Yorkshire, over 100 monasteries were scheduled for closure. So again, you've got some greater evidence there about the closure of monasteries and the impact that had on people. We've also got the fact that the government had an assault on saints' pilgrimages and holy days, and in particular in a place called Kirkby. They were extremely upset about the loss of St. Luke's Day. Now, one way to understand this desire for holy days is that at this time, people didn't get, as we do now, 25 days holiday a year. Holidays, days off from working in the fields, on the farm, were your holy days. And so when the Protestant faith kicked in and cancelled a lot of those holy days, people were extremely upset about that, because that had a significant impact on their life, as you can understand. We've also got the fact that they wanted, and very clearly expressed, that they wanted to restore the Pope as head of the church. They had an issue with the Act of Supremacy. They didn't agree with the divorce of Catherine of Aragon. Durham protesters carried the banner of St. Cuthbert and the banner of the Five Wounds of Christ, another very clear indication they saw themselves as religious pilgrims. And finally, the fact that they called it a pilgrimage, they called themselves pilgrims, suggests it was a religious rebellion. Next religious rebellion we're going to come to is under Edward, and we have the Western Rebellion, also called the Prayer Book Rebellion, a clear indication there that it has religious roots. So my summary is that religion was a primary factor in this rebellion, as it primarily aimed to remove the prayer book that Edward had brought in, the English prayer book, and return it to the Catholic faith. So this rebellion was primarily a reaction from people in Cornwall, Devon and Norfolk to the Edwardian Reformation, and was largely a result of the religious reform in 1549. This was the first rebellion in 1549, sometimes called the Year of Discontent. Secondly, they demanded a return of papal relics, images, the restoration of the chantries, and at least 2 monasteries in every county, so very clearly religious motivated demands. 13 of the 14 articles drawn up by the rebel captains at their camp near Exeter show they wanted restoration, not reformation. They also, as the pilgrims in the Pilgrimage of Grace, marched under the Five Wounds of Christ, and they rejected the English prayer book. They called it a Christmas game. They thought it was ludicrousy, and they didn't agree with the English Bible or the revised liturgy of 1547. They wanted a return of the Bible in Latin, of the Catholic Mass, etc. And that's the Western Rebellion. Now, the next rebellion under Edward, same year, the Year of Discontent, is the Kent Rebellion. Now, this was less religiously motivated, and I would suggest that religion was an underlying issue that helped to aggravate more dominant socio-economic issues. However, we have to accept religion played a role in this rebellion. In comparison to Western, it was actually the slow rate of Protestant change that people had an issue with in the Kent Rebellion. This was a Protestant area. They wanted greater Protestant reform, the opposite of the Western rebels. And so therefore they wanted really more proactive Protestant reform. They also called for better educated clergy, competent teaching of the catechism and primer for children, and good quality sermons. Next, we're going to come to Mary. So the main rebellion under Mary that we're going to talk about is the Wyatt Rebellion. Now, I would suggest that religion itself in the Wyatt Rebellion was not particularly corrosive under Mary. I think on the whole, people accepted Mary's Catholic reforms and the change back to Catholicism. I think one thing which is important is that the main cause of this rebellion was what we might term xenophobia, fear of foreigners, hatred of foreigners. And in particular, it was the Spanish marriage to Philip of Spain that the people were against. And I think we can see this as they were very fearful of that interference from foreign Roman Catholicism, the papacy, Spain, and that idea of England becoming another one of those kind of little colonies under the direction, under the order of these great Catholic powers in Europe. I think what happens under Henry when he has the Reformation is really what we see is a form of Catholicism without ties to Rome. He initially makes lots of Protestant changes, but over the rest of his reign, we see many of those reversed. The one thing that remains, however, is that he stays apart from Rome, and we don't see England return to that kind of state of a childlike state under the papacy, at the papacy's whim, who follow direction and follow order. Mary, however, wants to return to that. And I think by this point, nationalism in England is very significant. And that actually what we see in England by this point are many, many people who see themselves as English Catholics, but really English comes first. And so we see a lot of fear about this revival, this return to foreign influence through the Catholic faith, most notably. Now, in terms of evidence for the fact that Wyatt has some religious motivations, we definitely have a religious undercurrent. Kent is a strongly Protestant county. Many are concerned about Mary's attachment to Roman Catholicism and the fact this will only be emphasized with the marriage to Philip. Maidstone supplied 78 rebels, and it was a very Protestant area as well. However, on the other hand, what I've got here is a quote by Wyatt himself, who stated, "You may not so much as name religion, for that will withdraw us from the hearts of many." It was a direction he gave. Do not talk about religion. It shows his reluctance to play the religion card. He believed that xenophobia, kind of emphasizing British nationalism, was going to be the thing that was going to create greater support nationally for his rebellion. He did not believe that religion would be a unifying factor. He saw it as a divisive factor, whereas xenophobia, English nationalism, was more unifying. Despite that fact, I think that we can definitely say there are religious undercurrents, there are religious roots to this rebellion because of the intertwining nature of Catholicism and foreign interference at this point. Moving on to Elizabeth, I want to start with the Northern Earls Rebellion. So, for the Northern Earls, religion was a unifying factor or cloak under which greater problems of political marginalisation were hid. I believe that the elite nobility who essentially created this rebellion used religion as a cloak to incite the populace below them to join the rebellion. But I think for them, it was less about religion and more about factional strife, marginalisation, and a desire for greater power. Remember, Elizabeth changes the country back to Protestant after Mary's Catholic reign. However, Elizabeth does kind of support and herald tolerance. She has her religious settlements. After the Northern Earls Rebellion, we do see greater Protestant change as a reaction to the plots and the threats that she faces, most notably as well in 1570 with the excommunication by the Pope and kind of the incitement of the Pope to call on foreign powers to remove her. In terms of evidence, we've got the fact that they stated themselves, our first objective in assembling was the reformation of religion and the preservation of the person of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots plays a very pivotal role, I believe, in being kind of a magnet. A magnet is actually a direct quotation from the historian Bindoff. You can use that in your essays. It's fantastic to throw that in. But he says Mary was a magnet for all of the Catholics, both domestically, so within England, and abroad. So you know, we've got this constant figure during Elizabeth's reign who is essentially heralding and representing Catholic discontent, which many people can come behind and support during Elizabeth's reign. Secondly, we've got the fact that leading protagonists were Catholic, Northumberland, Westmoreland. There was a resentment of the newly appointed Bishop Pilkington in Durham. The fact the rebels went to Durham Cathedral and carried out a mass. They also walked under the banner of St. Cuthbert and the Five Wounds of Christ. Just going back to this very, very quickly, the point about leading protagonists being Catholic, when we see changes of faith by the monarch, we also often see the marginalization of nobility who have the alternative faith, and the elevation of nobility of the same faith of the monarch. You know, it's factionalism. And while the point that the leading protagonists were Catholic is absolutely evidence for this rebellion being of religious cause, we can also see that as evidence that it's a factional based rebellion, because the Catholic nobility have been marginalized under Elizabeth's reign due to their faith in the one instance, and therefore these two issues, the fact they are marginalized and the fact they're Catholic, are kind of interdependent on each other. Finally, we're going to talk about Shane O'Neill, the Irish Rebellion, or the 9 Years' War, as it's sometimes called. Again, I think religion is an underlying factor in this rebellion. It's not the primary factor. It's not particularly important, but it does cause kind of latent resentments towards Anglicization and Protestant English interference. So Ireland at the time was a predominantly Catholic country. They are angry after the 1570 papal excommunication. And what we've seen over time in Ireland is this growing resentment at English Protestant presence, trying to Anglicize, trying to colonize, trying to, you know, create plantations in Ireland, and this imbalance, I guess, of native Irish Catholics being subordinated under English migratory Protestants. So you've got religion playing a role as a role of frustration, but it's not the primary factor for Shane O'Neill. That's about power, that's about independence from English rule, that's about power essentially, and liberation, you might say. So that's my summary. These are all of the rebellions that have religious causes, religious links. We've obviously got some here which are more primarily caused by religion. For example, the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Western or Prayer Book Rebellion, arguably perhaps the Northern Earls Rebellion, depending on which way you want to interpret that. But every single one of these rebellions have the role of religion in nuance, and in an interdependent relationship with other causes as well. So what I absolutely advise you do is subscribe to the channel, like the video, because it tells me that this is the type of content that you find helpful. And I will be following this with a video on economic financial reasons very, very shortly, so that you can then fit that into your understanding, and you have a second paragraph on the economy, and you can start to see how this all works in symbiosis with each other.